Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 15th, 2022. Right now we're in the midst of a series of summits taking place in Asia. So let me begin by presenting you the words of President Widodo of Indonesia at the ASEAN meeting. He's also going to be chairing the G20 meeting, and here's what he said. ASEAN must become a peaceful region, an anchor for global stability, consistently uphold international law, and not be a proxy of any powers. ASEAN should not let the current geopolitical dynamic turn into a new Cold War in our region, unquote. Now note that he said upholding international law, not defending the so-called rules-based order. This summit in Indonesia is occurring as a new high-speed rail line is opening between Jakarta and Bandung. This is a project of Indonesian and Chinese cooperation and is somewhat indicative of the potential that exists were other nations to continue to join with the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, further in discussing this question of cooperation and also warning about the instability coming from the so-called G7 countries, there was a November 7th editorial in the Jakarta Post. And it starts by highlighting the dangers of economic, military, and security disasters. So it calls on leaders to, quote, lower their ego so as to not worsen the suffering of many people across the globe, unquote. And then it directly addresses the G7 leaders, calling on them to, quote, reverse their long-standing belief they can do no wrong and therefore can force their will against smaller or poorer nations, unquote. We've been hearing this from more and more nations, these words against the imposition of a rules-based order, from South Africa to India, now to Indonesia. And for those who don't know it, Indonesia is a nation with more than 270 million people and a growing economy. What's being expressed in this kind of language is the desire to put an end to colonialism. And whether it's called a unipolar order, the rules-based order, democracy versus authoritarianism, or the Great Reset, it's essentially calling for an end to the dictatorship of central banks, which assert that nations must not be able to use national sovereignty as an excuse to avoid accepting the one economic model that is imposed by the rules-based order. Instead, we're seeing moves toward multilateralism, towards cooperation, economic development. And this is economic development for mutual benefit, not to defend the interests of the few. One of the issues that remains to be seen about the G7 meeting, or G20 meeting rather, is whether they'll issue a statement condemning Russia for its actions in Ukraine. The Beltway paper Politico reports that Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, and China will refuse to condemn Russia. And I'm sure some of the other nations at G20 will join them. But the arrogance of the U.S. was on display from statements coming from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who's traveling with Biden to these meetings. She announced that sanctions against Russia will, quote, probably, unquote, remain in place, even if there's a settlement to the war in Ukraine. And she insisted that she will work with others to make it difficult for Russia to sell oil and gas. This is democracy. This is free market policy. Well, that's the approach that's been consistent from the British, US, NATO nations, that they will fight and use their military if necessary to sustain the bankrupt world order, which is now being rejected by a growing number of nations. One other note of significance in this current situation is the terror attack that took place in Istanbul yesterday, with 8 dead and 81 wounded. The Turkish government identified the PKK-YPG Kurdish terrorists as responsible. And the government said that since the YPG is funded by the United States, they would not accept condolences from the U.S. Embassy. This is especially important given Turkey's role as a mediator in the Ukraine situation and the role they played in initiating the grain shipment deal, which will provide relief to the poorer countries facing starvation. On another note, we had the Xi-Biden summit yesterday. There's not a whole lot we know about this other than the official communiques, which both sides said the talks were frank, that they were useful, and of course it's better to talk than not talk. The question is it just words? Is there some real intent behind it? The US and NATO continue to move ahead with a perspective for a global NATO, by which they mean containment of Russia and China by deploying military into the Indo-Pacific. So while it's useful to have the commitment to regular dialogue, and it's been reported that Tony Blinken will be heading to Beijing soon, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, continued to denounce the idea of global NATO. He said this represents a militarization of the Indo-Pacific region designed to contain Russia and China. One more note on the effects of sanctions. The reports came out yesterday of German exports to Russia, that they're half of what they were. In September 2022, they dropped by 52.9% from the level of exports from Germany to Russia in September 2021. That is cut in half. And the prospects are for even more dropping and an attempt to decouple Germany from China, the effect of which will be disastrous for the Germans. And that's why Chancellor Scholz went to China recently and why the industrial associations of Germany are insisting that there not be decoupling with China. Now, another example of the trade question and sanctions, trade between India and Russia is expected to double in the period ahead. And this includes trade denominated in regional and local currencies, national currencies, in this case, the ruble for the rupee. As for the United Kingdom, we have this bit of wisdom from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt. He said it's Putin's fault that there's a recession in the United Kingdom. Well, that's in keeping with what Liz Truss said, what Boris Johnson said, what Rishi Sunak is saying. Blame Putin. When in doubt, blame the Russians. What Hunt said is the question is not whether the United Kingdom is in a recession, but how to make it shorter and shallower. Well, I can tell him one thing. You're not going to make it shorter and shallower by doing more of the same. The British model, the UK model, the Thatcher model, you might say, of budget cuts, of credit going to speculation and not to industry, the Green New Deal, and so on, would make a recession permanent. So this is where you see the problem that we're facing internationally with the neoliberal ideology combined with the neoconservative war hawk mentality. So I would say to our friends in the United Kingdom, the solution is take power away from the lords of the City of London and fight for LaRouche's idea of a new Bretton Woods. There'll be an upcoming conference on November 22nd, which will include a growing number of officials from around the world to discuss precisely what it means to establish a new security and financial architecture centered around the idea of a new Bretton Woods. I'll include a link for you to register for this conference, and I'd urge you to take the time between now and November 22nd to study LaRouche's ideas, to look at his articles at the larouchepub.com and become familiar with his ideas of the four power agreement, the four economic laws, energy flux density, potential relative population density. All of these are conceptions which are crucial if we're to break out of this rules-based order and move into an era of peaceful cooperation among sovereign nations. Thanks for joining me. See you again tomorrow.